Morning, everybody. We'll just wait a few moments till everyone joins us. Good morning. Just waiting a few more moments. We're just getting people join us for the next minute or so. Thank you for being nice and early. Right, I think we might get started. We'll probably have a few more people joining us as we go on. Kia ora everybody, my name's Kate Wright from the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum. It's great to have such an interest in today's webinar, and I'm really delighted to introduce Dr Hillary Bennett. For some of you, she will need no introduction. You will have seen her perhaps at a forum event or in your own capacity in your organisation. Hillary is an organisational psychologist and she works with Leading Safety, one of the forum's trusted partners around health, safety and wellbeing leadership. So today the context is psychological safety, and I think what sort of prompted us to think about running a session like this was last year the Forum and Leading Safety started a new course called Be Well to Lead Well for leaders to support them with their own wellbeing and to help them lead wellbeing in their organisations. And after a trial of that course, we got together and discussed the fact that there was still a lot of confusion around psychological safety. What does it actually mean, and how do you lead an organisation that is psychologically safe? So here we've got Hillary to talk us through this. We will have time for some questions, hopefully. This session will run for an hour to 11. We'll stop briefly around halfway through to answer some of those questions, and then again at the end. I'm pretty sure we're not going to get through them all, but Hillary and the forum will be available post this session to help you if needed. So if you can please put your questions in the chat function so we can keep track of them, and then we'll prompt them to Hillary throughout the session. I'll hand over now to Dr. Hillary Bennett, and thanks all for joining us.
Thanks, Kate. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to be with you. As always, I'd like to just acknowledge the blessings that the forum gives me when they give me the opportunity to go and explore an area that I've always wanted to explore and never really had the time to. So I also just would like to put a bit of a starter into our conversation around psychological safety, because one of the learnings that I've come across over the last while is that psychologically safe really requires a humility and a vulnerability from each of us. And I did notice on LinkedIn today, someone had said in much more colourful language than I can use on a webinar, to hell with the theory. And I would just like to say that what I've tried to do today is actually to go into the evidence and say, what is the evidence around psychological safety in terms of whether this is something that we should be paying attention to, and what does the evidence tell us in terms of what we should pay attention to? So how do we make sense given based on some good research? And hopefully I've been able to package it up in a way that is helpful and usable for us to understand. And I also just want to put a proviso in here that I'm not putting myself out here as the expert. I'm putting myself out as someone who has taken a bit of time to really try and get my head around this. And I would love to get your questions and your feedback so we can all learn on this together. So I'm going to show some slides. Okay, hopefully that's all visible. Kate, can you see that?
Perfect.
Some of the language we love to use in the forum is the notion around obligations and opportunities. And so I've actually gone into this area around psychological safety under that same notion. So it's no surprise to any of you, what I will go to is my obligation piece, which, I think sits well and truly within the Health and Safety at Work Act, which we all know. And, that we have to give the highest level of protection to people in our workplaces, and that health means physical and mental health. So as Kate said, the Be Well to Lead Well program sort of put us into the psychological safety discussion because of the impact that it has on people's mental health. But of course, once you start exploring it as a concept and as an idea, the outcome of psychological safety goes well beyond supporting people's mental well-being, but in terms of a large number of really positive outcomes for any organization. But that is where my starting point was, in that the impetus for the conversation today has actually come under the work that we have been doing in the forum under mental health and in terms of mental well-being. And, you know, so what I'm going to do is frame up psychological safety as a key protective factor in terms of our mental health. And it is obviously then very closely entwined in terms of how we design the work. There's a strong focus currently on the importance of psychological safety. You see a lot of reference to it in the sort of more, you know, the more what I would call sort of the Google type literature. But if you go into this more scholarly research, you see a lot of interest in the idea as well. And there's good reason for this interest, because this research has shown us that psychological safety supports people to thrive in the workplace, and it certainly does prevent people dropping down in terms of that mental health continuum, in terms of where they're really struggling, or maybe to the point where they're actually really harmed by their work. But as I said, it's been linked to a range of positive organizational outcomes, and I won't go through that list. You can read that as well as I can, but I just want to make the point that, you know, it is fundamentally important in terms of learning, in terms of engagement, in terms of people's well-being, creativity, innovation. There's a host of reasons as to why people are paying attention to psychological safety. However, there's also a lot of conceptual confusion as to what we actually mean by psychological safety. And I know that, you know, in a recent forum session that I had with some CEOs, when I mentioned psychological safety, some people actually interpret that to mean psychological harm. All right, so I thought it might be helpful for us just to maybe, you know, do a little bit of reflection around the sorts of terminology and language that we've seen in this space, and for help us to get some sort of clarity around what we mean and what we don't mean. This doesn't mean to say that any of these concepts are not really valid concepts. It's just that we need to make sure that we're not using them in the wrong context. So, you know, as you know, in the forum, we've done a lot of work recently around this notion of psychosocial hazards and risks, and the mental wellbeing design framework that is being used is really about how we can help an organization to identify those things in terms of the design of work, the way the work is organized, the way the work is managed. It has the potential to harm people's mental health. There is also quite a lot of work being done, particularly, you know, in Australia, and picked up here in New Zealand as well through Massey's work around the psychosocial climate. And psychosocial climate, if you try and look at that in terms of what it means, is really more the shared perceptions around the organizational policies and processes in terms of protecting people's psychological health. So it's more around this shared belief that management, you know, protects and supports people's mental health. Psychological harm literally is how we would describe people's mental health, or at this point, sometimes mental illness as a result of their work. So they're sitting on that struggling and unwell side of the continuum. Psychological health and safety is another sort of terminology that gets bandied around quite a lot, and that really comes out of the Canadian space, where their national standards of Canada for psychological health talk about psychological health and safety as what an organization needs to do to promote mental health and to protect mental health. And mentally healthy workplace is work language that we're tending to use quite a lot in New Zealand in terms of describing the work that we're doing to ensure that the workplace doesn't impact on people's mental health, but it should not be used as a proxy for psychological safety. So each one of those concepts, as I'm saying, has value in its own right, but actually what we need to be careful of is making sure that we don't see psychological safety as those things. So that takes us to the point of with my first question that Kate sent out to everyone, which was, you know, so how do you define psychological safety? When you hear psychological safety, what comes to mind to you? Now, there's a good chance that maybe when you reflected on that question, you have dropped down into some of the areas that are identified on this slide. But what I'd like to do is clarify what I think maybe is a more helpful way for us to actually understand psychological safety. And we can go back a wee bit in history around this, because the term was originally coined by Edgar Schein and Warren Buffett far back as 1965, as providing an atmosphere where one can take chances without fear and sufficient protection. Please note that highlighted one. I'm going to come back to that shortly. But the concept has really been popularized more by Amy Edmondson, who's a professor at Harvard. And her definition, I think, is probably the most commonly accepted definition of psychological safety. And she defines it as a shared belief amongst group members that the group is a safe place to take risks, admit mistakes, and learn new things. And there again, I want you to pay attention to the highlighted word group. Someone else's work I think is really helpful in this space is Timothy Clark's work, who sees, that psychological safety exists when people feel included and safe to learn, to contribute, and to challenge the status quo without fear of being embarrassed or marginalized or punished. So my sense of trying to make, in my attempt to try and make sense of this area, I have sort of gravitated back to those two definitions as saying, actually, when we talk about psychological safety, it is around a shared belief that it's okay, to voice an opinion. It's okay to ask a question. It's okay to challenge the status quo without any fear of negative consequences. So I think those two definitions, I think, would be my guidance in terms of how we try and understand psychological safety. And, you can see in that slide there in terms of, when there isn't, none of us like to feel ignorant or incompetent. And when we have a fear that by voicing an opinion or challenging something, that's how we're going to feel, the chances are, we zip the lip and we don't actually say anything. So the reason I highlighted the one in the original, the early thinking around psychological safety, and then highlighted the group in terms of Amy Edmondson's definition, is that it's interesting to just think about, is psychological safety and a group or an individual concept, when that's how it was originally sort of framed up, as if I individually, one feels safe to raise things. And Amy Edmondson's work is really pushing us to say it's really more about a shared belief, because psychological safety is a social phenomenon. It's a social construct. It occurs in relation to other people. And so therefore, it's really the shared belief that it's okay for us in our workplace to raise and say things. And that then brings me to an interesting tension there. It's not really a tension. It's an interesting sort of understanding of the difference between trust and psychological safety, because we'd always say, obviously, we need some level of trust to have psychological safety. And I love this slide, which I found also in terms of some of the work that coming through from Amy Edmondson, and it's that trust is, will you give others the benefit of the doubt when you take a risk, take a risk. So as opposed to psychological safety, will others give you the benefit of the doubt when you take a risk? And I think that's just a slightly interesting way of looking at this notion of trust and psychological safety. So, trust is, I give you the benefit of the doubt, but psychology, others need to give you the benefit of the doubt that it's okay to take a risk. Now, the other question I asked you to think about before coming online this morning was to say, what are the costs of not having psychological safety, not having that sense that it's okay to learn or to contribute or to challenge without fear of any negative contribution. And I'm sure that you've all been able to identify several things that would be the cost of not having psychological safety. And, you know, I think that it's really key for us to understand that when people don't feel safe, they are very reluctant to stand out. They will keep quiet, they will withdraw, they are scared of being in the wrong, and so they keep quiet. So, you know, just if we go into the health and safety space and we say, well, what are the costs then for us to have people in our workplaces where they see something and they feel fearful of not raising it, not highlighting, or they go into a toolbox meeting or a tailgate meeting, you know, and they don't say anything. And as I've seen in forestry so often, the real meeting then happens, you know, outside the container once the meetings happen. So what are the costs to us in a range of aspects of an organization's life? But, you know, if we just go into the health and safety space, the cost to us of people not feeling comfortable to speak up and have a voice. And there's another interesting area, I'll come back to this a bit later, but the difference between, you know, thinking that having a voice and keeping quiet, they're not just opposite ends of the same construct. They're actually quite different. The one is, you know, I will be reluctant to speak up, but the other is I deliberately choose to withdraw and hold back information that I know would make a difference. And so, you know, there are some real significant costs for us in terms of not having that psychological safety. Now, another stone in the shoe around this area that I think is worth us exploring is that actually is to say, well, what is psychological safety not? You know, and here it raises some really interesting question marks for people. And I'm going to go to the words of Tim Clark here, because I think he can say it better than I can say it. He's saying it's not a shield for accountability. It's not niceness. It's not coddling or consensus decision-making. It's not unearned autonomy or political correctness or rhetorical reassurance. So in other words, it's not about wrapping people in cotton wool and not being able to say something that you think is really important because of political correctness. But neither is it freedom to say whatever one likes and to stay on your comfort zone. So in terms of linking that word comfort zone, I'm going to go back into some of the work that Amy Edmondson has done, where she very clearly articulates this notion of psychological safety and accountability, and in terms of how these two things are interacting and what we need to be aiming at. So, you know, if you talk about psychological safety from being, you know, having very low psychological safety to high psychological safety, and sort of our motivational accountability on the other axis from low to high. If you've got low psychological safety and you've got low accountability from people, you know, she says you'll be in the apathy zone, okay? But on the other hand, if you have high psychological safety and low accountability, she argues that sometimes people will stay in their comfort zone and they will feel safe, but there's no sense of actually, I have a duty here, I have an obligation here to raise things and talk about things and say things and share things that I see. So she talks about that being as people being in their comfort zone. Of course, if you go to very high levels of accountability and low psychological safety, that's where she refers to people being in their anxiety zone, where I'm actually too scared to say something. So I understand my accountability, but I'm not going to say anything because actually it doesn't feel safe for me. So the real goal for us, isn't it, is to get into that learning zone where we have high levels of psychological safety, but also high levels of accountability. And from an organizational perspective, this is really important because what it tells us, and I'm going to go into a leadership lens here, what it tells us is that there's work for us to do to help people make sense of why it's so important to hear their voice, and to ensure that that there are mechanisms and processes in place to be able for people to have a voice. But one of the starting points around psychological safety from a leadership perspective is to go right back to the conversation about what it is, why it's important, and what is our individual accountability or our group accountability to share things, to ask questions, we see things. So Kate and I had agreed that we would just pause at this slide and just see whether there were any questions coming through before I continued. So Kate, I don't know if there are any questions that have come through so far.
We haven't had any questions, but if people would like to raise a question, they can pop it in the chat. I think someone has just raised their hand, so I'm just going to go up and see if I can put them off. If you would like to speak, let me know. Otherwise, oh, here we go. We've got some coming through now, Hillary.
Okay.
Tony asks, are there measurable levels of the organisation's culture in psychological safety, meaning psychological culture level an organisation can measure and aim to improve upon?
Yeah. So if you're asking, are there measures of psychological safety? Yes, there are. And again, this what seems to be the one that's used most extensively is one that has been developed by Amy Edmondson. So if you're looking for an assessment or a tool to be able to assess, if that's the question to assess psychological safety, I would suggest you go. It's not a long set of questions, but it's being used, widely across internationally, and a lot of evidence, the research evidence has been using that, and it's well validated as a good way to measure psychological safety. And then the other area, Tony, is where I'm coming into next, is the work around Tim Clark's work, where he is talking about psychological safety in stages. I'm going to explain that shortly, and he's also got some ways of actually going out and measuring that. And I'm going to put my own Bob's worth in here and say that I think one of the ways that you can really is look at the culture of your psychological safety is to reflect on the quality of the conversations that are happening across the organization, and I'll come back into that later. So thanks for that question. Great question. Anything else, Kate?
Yes, we do. We have Ross is asking, is this different to a fair and just culture?
Good question as well. So yes, it is. But can I put it this way? I don't know that you can have a fair and just culture without a level of psychological safety. So think of it as a foundational piece. If you want people, fair and just culture is in my understanding, is people are feeling sure that they will be treated in a fair, consistent way, and that the focus will be on learning, which is why I love this work around the accountability and the psychological safety piece, because if you're saying actually what we want to be is in the learning zone, I mean, that's exactly where we want to be in terms of just culture piece, isn't it? Right? With just culture, we're saying is we want people to feel comfortable to raise things without fear of recrimination, but also have some sense of understanding that, if they're completely gone off piss here and they're just, this is, really just, I'm hooning around here, I'm doing things and sabotage, I'm just, reckless in my behavior, there should be some accountability. But the essence for me around your just culture is how do we learn? And for those of you well entrenched in the health and safety space, you might even go way back to some of the work of James Reason and his original thinking around the just culture piece, and saying that, what a safety culture was, we had a learning culture, we had a reporting culture, etc. So these two concepts are very closely linked to each other.
Thanks, Hillary. And then just perhaps one more before you continue on. This is from Karen. Have you got some examples of some organisations that are doing a great job in this area, and what are they doing? My perspective is that every level of leadership in an organisation needs to understand how they influence this.
Oh gosh, I'd be a wealthy woman if I could get $1 for every time asked me is, have an organization that's doing some good work in this space. And, there are lots of organizations that are certainly starting to talk about this and to do that. I don't know that I have come across any organization that I would put up at the moment as an exemplar, but that's just maybe because my travels haven't taken me into that place. But the point around the second part of that comment, Kate, is the piece around the leadership. And that's where I want to go to as we work through, is actually this is strongly the work of leaders. This is strongly of the work of leaders. You can't just ask people to say, speak up, and then just, walk away and say, well, I gave you permission to speak up and you didn't say anything. We've got to create the platform. We have to, we have to nurture this. And that's why I think we're using the word foster here. We have to foster the belief that is okay, and who needs to do that is leaders. And I'm not just talking about your senior leaders, I'm not just talking about your CEOs and your general managers, I'm talking right through the organization. But of course, you know, let's bear in mind the slide that we've got on the screen at the moment. There is a personal accountability there as well, which is actually I need to feel not only that it's important for me that I can do that, but also actually understand that it is part of everybody's work to ensure that that they take accountability and that they actually do share, that they have a voice and that they use their voice. Right.
Thanks, Hillary. And I think, also what Karen was meaning was perhaps also that it's people, not just the senior leaders, but also the people leaders throughout the organization too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It goes right through. But I think to add on to that, of course, that requires the mindset of your senior leaders to understand the importance of providing people leaders with an understanding of what their work is in terms of creating psychological safety. So, so it's absolutely the work of everybody in terms of every people leaders, but, do senior leaders actually really understand the value of this and therefore carve out and value the time that's going to be required? Because it's not only a leadership piece, as I'm going to go to later, there's obviously some organizational processes in place that would make a huge difference in terms of this. So what I'm going to do, I did mention the work of Tim Clark, and I used his definition early on, and it's very similar to the work of Amy Edmondson in terms of talking about it, but he takes a slightly different perspective. So let me continue sharing some slides, so his work is saying is, psychologically, he argues that it goes in stages. It's not a binary concept. It's not something we have or we don't have. And I love this little saying, which is why I put it into the slide: all models are wrong and some are useful. And I'll explain why I put it in here with this particular slide in a moment. But what Tim Clark is arguing is that he goes for a sort of staged approach to psychological safety, and he says that the very building block around psychological safety is the importance of people feeling included, a sense of belonging. He says that you cannot go through to the other stages if you don't have that people don't actually feel I'm accepted for who I am, in my fullness of who I am. And this, I think, for those of you who've been following some of the work of the forum, really links so well into the work of Donna Hicks around dignity in the workplace. So bottom line of the rung of psychological safety is people need to have, we all have a huge sense of a need for belonging. And so is that actually met? We'll talk about how we can do that in a minute. So that's that sense of inclusion, safety. And then he says what we want, the next level of goes to where people are now starting to feel they belong, and they're now starting to feel comfortable to ask questions. And he argues that this goes quite strongly to a human need to understand. So we start asking questions, and then the next stage is I feel I'm not only asking questions, but I'm actually now making a contribution. I actually have some ideas here that I think would make a difference. And the final stage of psychological safety, according to Clark, is that's the point at which people feel comfortable to to challenge the status quo. It's the point at which someone says, well, actually, yeah, I don't think that's such a good idea for these reasons. And so his argument is that it's not a binary concept. It's not we either have it or we don't have it. It is that we go through stages, and we can't expect people all of a sudden to challenge the status quo, whether when they don't feel included or they haven't actually been able to feel that they actually can ask questions and learn. So if you look at that, that slide is quite interesting, because in terms of respect and permission, and there's that word exploitation there, which he says that You know, when you give people, you hold people accountable, to use Amy Edmondson's language, or you push them into, you know, you say, actually, you've got the permission to, you know, I give you permission to speak up about anything. But we haven't given the psychological safety, we haven't given, in his language, he's talking about respect here. He argues that's what we would call exploitation. We would say, actually, we expect you to do this, we expect you to share your ideas, you expect you to challenge, but we actually don't give you the basic respect just as an individual. But he said if you go really high up in the respect axis and low on permission, that's where you would fall into the trap of being fairly paternalistic. You know, so I respect you, but I don't actually give you any freedom or permission to question or to contribute, etc. The reason I put that all models are wrong and some are useful, I put this slide, I think is because when you start trying to really explore this as a concept, you know, I think most people, we certainly found in the Be Well to Lead Well program, when we started sharing this information and having some conversations with some CEOs, it really resonated a touch base. But on reflection, you know, the question is, you know, if it's a group phenomena, you know, can you talk about psychological safety across your whole organization? Or actually, could you be saying, actually, we could have, and I think this is maybe much more realistic. There may be, you know, you might find one, and I had this experience yesterday working in an organization where I was going across different departments, where they, at one level, you thought this group has a really high level of psychological safety. They're feeling comfortable, they're challenging each other, they're questioning. And then I went into another group in the same organization, and they were very, very quiet, withdrawn. They didn't want to share anything else. There was a real reluctance, and you could get that sense of, is it quite safe to raise my concerns around some of these things? So, you know, here I'm thinking is that, you know, we mustn't just look hook, line and sinker buy into these models and frameworks. We need to make them work for ourselves. But I think what's valuable for us with this work is to say, if we're serious about trying to create psychological safety in organizations, it's helpful not to see it as a binary concept. It's not an either or. It's helpful to say that actually some building blocks that we need to have in place. So if we're asking our people leaders as part of their KPIs and their accountabilities to be, you know, the designers and an environment where it is safe to work, to talk and talk up, then we need to say, actually, there's a couple of things you've got to have in place before you can get to the point where you can ask people to be necessarily just challenging the status quo. The next slide, I'm not going to go into much details. It does expand out on this work, but I think the point I would like to make here, just briefly going into the slide, so there's those four stages, is how these levels of psychological safety, or the stages of safety, are very closely linked to some very basic human needs. So if you look at that inclusion safety, you know, this really talks to our needs as individuals, as humans, everybody's need to feel connected and to feel that we belong. So do I really feel as part of this group, as part of this team? Do I really feel part of this division? Do I feel part of this organization? It's really important. And I'm going to go into, you know, now you can sort of taking, well, what is a people leader's role to help people feel involved? And what are the organizational structures? So one of the key things around exclusion that we want to think about is our onboarding of people. You know, do we onboard people by giving them a day to go through a whole lot of, you know, documents to sign it off and say, yeah, now we know what we need to do, overwhelm them with information? Or do we say, actually, onboarding is about helping people to feel included. It's about helping them feel that they belong. It's about helping them connect with people, not just within their team, but to connect with some of the rituals that occur within that organization. So, you know, what is our work to do to right at that bottom level to make sure that people have a sense of inclusion? You know, if we go into the learner safety there, you know, it's playing to all of our needs to learn and grow. And if we take a link this to the 5 ways to wellbeing work, that's, you know, promoted by the New Zealand Mental Health Foundation work, which I think is really solid work, is actually, you know, that keep learning practice. We know, and I know some recent research that's been done in New Zealand has found that, you know, that keep learning and the the mindfulness one, take notice. In terms of our impact and well-being, those two practices are fundamentally important and have the greatest impact. They all have an impact, but those two together seem to have the greatest impact. So this plays to this notion about as human beings, we want to learn, we need to be curious, and we are curious, and we want to be able to ask questions about things. So if we don't create an environment where people can learn, we're not going to get ourselves into that point where people will feel comfortable to ask. But then, the contributor safety piece refers to our basic human needs to make a difference. We don't just want to accept things as this is the way it is, and we have ideas, and we want to make a contribution, and we want to add to things and to improve things. So that contributor safety playing to our basic need to make a difference. And then, of course, the challenger safety is playing to our human needs, actually, is to make things better. And so I think that framework gives us some really good clues around what we need to do in terms of building the competency of people leaders to ensure that we reach those higher levels of psychological safety. It also gives us some clues around some of the organizational practices that might need to be in place in order to meet those basic human needs. I have one more slide, which I'm just going to leave in the pack, and I'm not going to talk to you. You can see here that people that have been dabbling around with some of Clark's ideas have not always put it in a staged process. Some people are just putting it as these are 4 key dimensions that we need to have in terms of a psychological safety, where members feel safe to belong to a team, where people are able to learn through asking questions, where members can ask questions of others' ideas and challenge significant changes. So I'm just suggesting to you, as I did say, I'm learning as much as anyone else in this space. Tim Clark's original work is around stages, and that is helpful at one level, and other people are taking it and not seeing it initially as having to go through a stage process, but almost just some key pillars around psychological safety. And going back to my point there, all models are wrong and some are useful, and it's the same issue we have with all the safety culture maturity models. We don't get to a stage and then stay there. I think there is movement up and down across those stages, and you might find, as a Dutch proverb I read the other day recently, and I love it, but it was more around trust. It said, trust comes in on foot, but goes out on horseback. So, you might get to a stage where people are feeling comfortable to challenge, and then something happens. Someone comes in and says something that completely undermines that level of psychological safety, and then all of a sudden you're right back somewhere down in terms of those lower stages. So just some ideas in terms of what we're actually talking about. One of the other questions I asked you was, what might be the leader's role in terms of psychological safety? And here's what I'd like to share with you before we go into that question in a bit more detail. And I'm going to use this language, which I have picked up and I love it. I said, psychological safety is the engine, it's not the fuel. What do we mean by that? If you look at the evidence, it says psychological safety tends to be defined, most commonly accepted definition is that one around Amy Edmondson. It's a shared belief, etc. If you look at, we're saying, is that to get that shared belief, there are a whole lot of antecedents. One of the ones is this question that you already had, is the leadership mindset and practices right across the organization. The other antecedent, so an antecedent is anything that comes before, so these are the triggers, is what's been called team learning behaviors. Whether you want to use that language or not, I don't care. What we're talking about there is that there are behaviors within a group that are around sharing skills. I don't hang on to my knowledge and skills. I'm sharing my skills and knowledge. I'm seeking and sharing information. So some very clear practices that exist within a group that are reflective of learning behaviors. And remember, accountability and psychological safety, to be in that top right-hand quadrant where we are learning, this is the key thing, is that the team members, group members, really they demonstrate these sorts of practices and behaviors. Another key thing is a trigger is that consistent empathy by everyone. Clarity around roles is really important. Onboarding with intention rather than just onboarding as a ritual. Fair and consistent process. So Eva spoke about that just culture piece. This is really part of that storyline as well. And what I'm going to call straight talk conversations. And straight talk conversations goes to some of those concerns that psychological safety is wrapping people in cotton wool and not being able to say things. It is not that. Straight talking is where I, with respect and with all the best intention of the world, am able to say, actually, this is how I see it. And this is maybe how I think we could do this a little bit differently. So I battled to find a word to describe those conversations. And I do need to give credit to my colleague Philip for saying, why don't you talk about that as straight conversations? And so, with those antecedents, we build up psychological safety, and therefore we get a whole range of outcomes. And you can see I've included just culture there as an important part of the outcomes that we get. So let's go into one of those top antecedents then, which is actually the leadership piece. And I'm going to go back into good health and good forum language, which we've been using in terms of our leadership development in the forum and in leading safety over the last decade, I would say, is the notion of mindset and practices. So mindset's the stuff that sits between your ears. It's your beliefs, it's your values, it's your assumptions about how the world goes round, and the practice is what you do with your hands and your feet, and what happens between your ears drives what you do with your hands and your feet. So here are some key mindsets I would suggest are really important if we are going to foster psychological safety. Your leaders really need to believe that everyone makes mistakes, so it's important we can admit and learn from them. Linked to that is this notion that psychological safety is around humility and it's around vulnerability. I actually am prepared to put out that I make mistakes and be a little bit vulnerable around some of these things. Another mindset is, speaking up shows you committed to a safe worker. That's about the accountability piece, isn't it? It's actually, I understand that if I am committed to looking to my duty of care to myself and others, then actually I need to speak up. So that's some examples of mindsets. I'm sure there are a host of others that we can. Mindsets drive hands and feet in terms of what we do. So I have spent a fair amount of time, to be quite honest, probably more time than I should have in terms of a short webinar, but trying to distill for us what these practices look like. And here's my offerings today. I think in terms of practices, if we're really going to have good leadership practices around health, is for leaders, no matter where they sit, to be curious, to take risks, to be tolerant of mistakes, to embrace positive conflict, and to create space for new ideas, even the wild ones. I think it's really important that leaders, in terms of their practices, that they're modest about their own capabilities, they acknowledge their own shortcomings, and they admit their own mistakes. As I say, that's that part of that humility piece and part of that vulnerability piece that is really important. And for so many leaders, there is that mindset, which is actually that I need to have all the answers, and if I don't have all the answers, or if I admit to the fact that I don't understand this, that makes it really difficult for other people to be able to share their ideas. So I think that's humility and vulnerability is really important. To be empathic is really key, and I think that's coming consistently through the evidence, which is saying actually to create and foster psychological safety, you have to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes. You actually have to be able to have a practice of trying to teach people to see things from other people's perspective. And those of you who've ever worked with me will know how we tend to go and gravitate to Ronald Harford's work about going on the balcony. And going on the balcony is about, dropping out of getting off the dance floor and going into the balcony, seeing patterns and trends and seeing perspective. And I think this is, part of that empathy. So you can't really understand things if you haven't been in somebody else's shoes, and you really need to be able to understand their perspective. And then, of course, one of the key things in terms of your leadership practices there is about, asking genuine questions, inviting people to have a voice, making it really difficult to stay silent, encouraging dissent, and to listen, to understand, and not to judge. So here are some ideas I'd love to leave with you in terms of some questions that I think would be really helpful in this space, okay? So if you're really going to encourage and give people, invite people to have a voice and ensure that they're able to have that voice, you know, these are some really great questions that I've come across. You know, what haven't we considered? Do you have any nagging questions? Now, Philip and I've used those, that is our key sort of ground rule whenever we work in groups. And really what we're doing is we're giving people permission to disagree, giving people permission to say, actually, I'm not quite sure that this is how it should go, whatever. You know, who can give us a different opinion or suggestion that we haven't discussed? Go out for those contributions, and not, you know, that there's things that have been withheld, but because people are a little fearful that it might be a wild idea, you know. Who can poke holes in this idea? Give people permission, you know, to really, you know, to pull it apart and try and understand it. What could make this a bad idea? So I love that question. And then this one I think is really helpful. Is this if this idea is 7, so like this is a great idea, but what could make it a 10? What if we could just change that dial a little bit? What might be some of the ideas? So I think what I'm trying to suggest here is that in terms of the fostering the psychological safety, we have to look at what leaders' practices, their mindset and their practices. And so to the question of what have I seen in exemplars, that I, to be honest, haven't seen, and again, this just might be my travels, but I haven't really seen any organizations who have said, what do we need to do to build the mindset and the practices of our people leaders to ensure that we actually build that shared belief that it's okay to speak up, to contribute, to challenge. And I think there is some really good work for us to do. And, you know, in terms of the work we're doing in the forum, that's one of the things that we're looking at in terms of the Be Well, Lead Well program, to really start unpacking what this leadership mindset and practice might be at a CEO level. But actually, your point is, it's really important all the way down an organization. I put in that earlier slide the notion of one of the antecedents is the importance of conversation, and I talked about calling it this straight talk conversations. So I'd like to just share with you this very recent work that has been done with Amy Edmondson and one of her colleagues, and I think it's really helpful to look at, you know, what we're saying is people need a voice. Okay, we need to create an environment where they can use that voice. The difference was we have a voice, but do we speak up or do we remain silent? And in terms of, you know, looking at in terms of outcomes being productive and unproductive outcomes, you know, that when we have an environment where we have a belief that it's not safe to talk, you know, people are withholding at their views and their ideas and their information, as opposed to contributing, we're in real trouble there. It's a real risk to us. But I wanted to use this slide also to go back to the point that psychological safety doesn't mean I can say whatever I like in whatever manner I like, or I can do whatever I like. It isn't saying that. It's not giving people a get out of jail free card here. It's actually saying we need to be accountable in a way that what we say doesn't harm other people. So it's not about just saying, you know, you need to say whatever you want to say. It's actually, how do I make a contribution? How do I actually go out in terms of learning? So pulling these things together, I'm going to suggest is that, you know, psychological is a critical endeavor, but no easy feat. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't just happen. It needs to be at the forefront of strategy. This needs to be something that we actually say, we, you know, going ahead, it's one of our key goals is to create a workplace where there is psychological safety. And it requires courage and commitment to challenge the status quo and build a culture where people are willing to use their voice. And knowing that they're not going to be negative consequences for them, but it's not saying, as I said many times, you know, it's not saying that this gives us permission to harm people by what we say. I do think it requires a fundamental shift in mindset and practices of leaders and supportive organizational processes. I think these things go hand in hand. It's no use just providing the opportunity to people to shift their mindset and to build up some really good practices if our organizational processes do not come in and support that. So, for example, my onboarding as an example, it's really important that if we understand the importance of inclusion and acceptance of who we are for who we are as being the absolute building block of psychological safety, then we have to go right back to when we first bring people in. And some people have argued, and I think there's some truth in this, maybe it even goes right back to our hiring processes in terms of the messages that we're sending through to people. It's not created overnight. It's delicate and dynamic, as I said earlier. You know, it can come in on foot, but it can leave on horseback. It's perishable. You know, just because we've got it doesn't mean to stay. It's going to stay there, and it requires intention. And let that be the word that I, want you to take away from my ramblings this morning, is if we're going to really create and foster psychological safety, that belief that it's okay, to voice an opinion and to challenge and to contribute without negative consequences. This requires intentionality. It will not happen just on its own. But I want to go back and also say it's not a substitute for effective psychosocial risk management, okay? I'm not suggesting that because we've now got to focus on psychological safety, that we're underplaying the importance of knowing what your risk to people's mental health is. So this is not, let's just say, oh, we've done that wave last year and this year we're going to focus on psychological safety. It is absolutely an obligation for us to understand the things that risk people's mental health. What we do know is that when we don't feel safe to have a voice, that has a real significant impact, and that in itself constitutes a risk for people. But I'm going to go into the proactive side. I'm going to go to the opportunity side. And I'm going to say, I would suggest that psychological safety is the foundation of good work design. If we really want to go into redesigning the work in a way that enables people to thrive as a result of the work, then we need to ensure that basic building block is there. We can't expect people to share and contribute to designing work so that it doesn't impact in a negative way in terms of people's mental health and their physical health if they don't feel comfortable to raise some questions. Now, I'm conscious of time, and that is my last slide, so I'm going to hand it back to Kate. And so thanks very much, everyone. We'll take a few questions now, but honestly, if you've got any questions and you've got anything you want to bounce around, I'm always on the other end of an email or a call. So thanks, Kate. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Hillary. We will try and get through a few questions. The first one, which came up in our last break, was from Len. How do you distinguish between a psychological safety issue versus a competence or lack of issue?
Well, psychological safety is about, if you go back to the definition, it's a belief that I can speak up without negative contributions, negative consequences. So it's not a competency, it's a belief. What we need to do is build up the competencies of people, leaders, to be able to create an environment where people, if they weren't competent, could say, actually, I don't know how to do that, rather than just trying to do that, or be overly confident and giving it a go without saying, actually, I need some support here. So I see them as quite different.
Thanks, Hillary. The next one from Paul. How much of the dimensions of safety are individual traits versus provided by the leader or organisation?
So I'm not quite sure I totally get the question, Paul, but if I can go back to saying fostering psychological safety will be more, but if you're going to go to individual traits, I'd suspect it's easier for some people than others. For some people, it's easier to be empathic and they've got a high level of emotional intelligence, and maybe the space is easier for them to go into. but I do believe that we can build our practices. I think we need to shift mindset and build our practices, but to do that in isolation from trying to also ensure that we've got, processes for enabling a just culture, processes to enable good boarding, processes to develop the competency of our people. These things go hand in hand, I think.
Thanks, Hillary. The next one's from Rebecca, and it's something that I'll touch on just at the end around what options there are available for leaders here. But she's asking, do you have any recommendations for training leaders can take to help build their knowledge on the subject and foster psychological safety within their workforce?
At the moment, no. I'm going to be cheeky and say, watch the space. That's some of the work we do, that we're doing in the Forum for CEOs, and certainly it's sparked my real intention in terms of the need to be able to do that. To be honest, I don't know that we've been doing work around skilling people, leaders, in terms of understanding mental health. But I don't think we've done the work we need to do to understand people, understanding of psychological safety and what needs to be done to ensure psychological safety. I think they are different. They link, but different. So to be honest, no. I'll just say watch the space.
Chris asks, are there any examples of good questions to ask in a survey of an organisation to test where we are in the psychological safety journey?
Yeah, so can I circle back to my comments on, from what I can see, that has been used both in a sort of more academic environment, but also used in a really practical environment, has been the short survey by Amy Anderson. And what I'll do, everyone, is I'll find that and send that link to Kate, and she can send it out.
Brilliant, thank you. Michelle asks, leaders may think they're asking those questions, I think referring to your earlier slide with the great examples there, but if they're not creating the environment for people to subjectively feel safe, then they'll get silence in return. Would you agree fostering the environment is most important?
Well, I think so. Fostering the environment, is my understanding, comes from what the leader does in terms of their own, in terms of modeling. So do they model a willingness to admit mistakes? Do they model their willingness to ask questions when they don't understand? So fostering that environment goes back to the practices of those individuals. And part of that practice is also when they're in conversation, either in a one-on-one or in a group context, is who they are in that session, but also the sorts of questions that they're asking that enable people feel to raise. And of course, what I didn't mention, and of course is a really important practice, is then of course how I respond. So I ask you for your opinion and then I dismiss it. Well, then I'm not going to give you anything. So it's partly not only asking the question, but it's listening to, I said earlier on, it's about listening to understand, not judge, but it's also how you respond to it. So for me, it's those practices that will build the environments.
I probably have time for two more, perhaps. The next one, while making mistakes and error may be acceptable, fail safely, what if it causes a critical failure? How does the regulator look at that aspect while investigating? Well, I'm sure you can't speak on behalf of WorkSafe or with other regulators, but any thoughts to add there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I know, and I'm going to go back to Eric Hollnagel's work, which Eric Hollnagel, who really challenged us thinking in terms of safety 1 and safety 2 thinking. He's saying, if failure is the point that it will risk people's life and let's go to physical or mental harm, then we need to do everything in our power to ensure that failure doesn't occur. So and then that's why I really pushed on that concept. It's really is important that we're not saying that psychological safety is, look, I can do whatever I like as long as I admit it, then that's okay. We're not saying that. We are saying there is a strong sense of accountability here. But you will not learn. So learning is the key. Psychological safety and learning fundamentally intricately linked together. If we want to learn, then we have to be able to understand it. But as Kate says, I can't speak on behalf of the work of the regulator, and they have their own agenda. They'll come in with the different, with their objectives on that. But what we need to do is, how do we maximize learning? How do we get the information we need to ensure that we have a workplace that does not harm its people.
And I think we've probably got time for one more from Tony. How do we get management buy-in, I think, with psychological safety, from being subjective about the topic to being open and objective, making resources available? What would be a great starting point?
Well, Tony, a great question again, and it sort of goes back to where I think what I'm seeing in the evidence is that it's fundamentally important. It's the mindset of your senior leaders need to understand the value of doing this and the costs of not doing it, so that they then are willing to provide the time and the resources to actually nurture this, because it's not going to happen overnight. We have to be patient. We have to say it has to be part of, strategically, with the same ways we say, actually, our strategy here, our long-term goal here is not to hurt people. Our long-term goal is to have a work environment where actually we can learn because people feel safe to raise things. So, not very short answer to what's quite a complicated question, but happy to have the conversation offline at any point in time.
Thanks, Hillary, and thank you very much, everyone. I just, before we go, want to go back to one of the points I made at the start, which was the introduction of the Forum in Leading Safety's new course, which is Be Well to Lead Well, which is for leaders and senior execs. I'm going to send around some more information when I send around the recording of this webinar later today. But if you're looking for something as a leader, a senior leader, or for your senior leaders to help them in this space, not only with their own mental well-being, but also how they can lead, which will include some of this work that Hillary has talked about today, and gives them a chance to work with other leaders and CEOs and senior leaders to talk about how to lead wellbeing well in their organisations, then that might be a really good option for them. There's lots of different ways that people can run the course, and I will send that around as well. But really like to say thank you to Hillary once again for providing what is a clearly very topical and much needed webinar on this issue. As she said, I'll include her email in the post-event email that I send around. So please do get in touch with her or the forum if you need any support. And we wish you well. Have an enjoyable rest of your day. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.